Everybody, welcome to the 4040 Vision podcast. I am your host, Khaled Abdallah, and I'm joined today by my good friend and special guest, Chris Burton. How you doing today, man?
I'm doing well, brother. It's always good to be here. Always good to see you, man. Hope all is well with you too, man.
Everything's great here. I appreciate you. This has been a long time coming. We've been talking about doing this podcast about kind of a follow-up to our original Deion Sanders and Colorado pod a few years
Right.
back. I wanted to talk about Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter. And the funny thing is, when we first talked about it, I think we first had it scheduled, it was pre-NFL draft.
Right.
So we had I think we both had a different podcast in mind. It was going to
Mm-hmm.
be almost a victory lap for Dion and Shedeur and Travis, who
Entirely.
collected all kinds of accolades after a pretty good season at
Right.
Colorado. I mean, Travis wins the Heisman, Shedeur
Come
wins
on.
the Johnny Unitas Award
Right.
for best quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
Just a long list of accolades and awards, and of course, things changed pretty quickly on draft night. Uh, and we're definitely going to talk about that. But before
Yeah.
we get into Shedeur and everything that's going on, Travis gets picked second overall. The Jags trade up, spend a lot of picks to get him.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of his NFL prospects? How excited are you to watch him play at the pro level?
I really think he's going to be a generational talent. You know, especially with the contrast of us talking about Travis and Shedeur, you think about Travis making the proclamation that if he can't be a two-way player, he's not even going to play. Like he doesn't want to play. And you would think with just like the tight constraints that NFL teams put on players, where you don't really get a chance to sort of like make those sorts of demands, for it to be like, okay, well that's what he's going to do, tells you just like how pro ready he is. And I think he has such a good head on his shoulders. I saw the other day this um, mom, I suppose, on social media posted a picture of her sitting next to. You see this? Like she was sitting next to
Yeah,
him
she looked like
on a
she
plane or
was a
something.
grandma. She was a grandma. She
She's
looked
a
like about in
grandma,
her
right?
70s
Right.
or 80s. Yeah.
Absolutely. And she was just saying, like, he's such a nice young man. I'm definitely pulling for the Jaguars. It's like you couldn't ask for a better commercial. You know what I mean? And just in terms of character, in terms of excellence on the field, I think he really is the total package in that way. And I really expect him to have a tremendously successful career. Whether or not the Jaguars will always be his team is a completely different story, but I expect him to be a pro's pro.
I think it was a good thing that he ended up on a franchise like Jacksonville that maybe doesn't have some of the like traditional constraints or
Yes.
like old school values or whatever you want to call it of like
Right.
the Giants or the Browns where he
Yeah,
was,
exactly.
that originally slotted to go, or some of the other teams that there might be a little more pressure. It's almost like Jacksonville is kind of like the backwater of the NFL where you can kind of do whatever you want.
Absolutely.
Urban Meyer was doing all kinds of crazy stuff and he kept his
That's
job
right.
for a while. So,
It's
that's
experimenting over there
yeah,
in Duval,
exactly. He's going to get to play in, he's from Florida, so he gets to be close to home.
right?
So it's almost like a perfect situation for him. And of course, that's kind of juxtaposed with how things worked out with Shedeur
Yeah.
and where he ends up and everything like that. So, as you're watching the first round and you're seeing this young man, drop further and further completely out of the first round, what was your initial reaction to what was happening, at least, on that Thursday night?
Well, it'd be hard to not describe it as shock, right? Like we watched enough drafts to know how to have compassion for like the kid who's like the last one in the room, right? Like that's
Yeah,
never a
Aaron
fun thing to
Rodgers, Lamar
watch.
Jackson, they're dropping to the 30s or late 20s. Yeah.
It's never fun to watch that happen to a kid. It just feels very embarrassing. Like, these kids who are being left in this room didn't experience it, but those of us who aren't professional athletes may know what it's like to be the last one picked for dodgeball, the basketball, whatever sort of pickup game. This never happened to like the Lamar Jacksons of the world, the Shedeurs of the world, but just thinking about that sort of compassion on that level, just like, man, like what is going on? It just feels very confusing. I had a sense of dread, to be honest with you, Khaled, from the time Shedeur had those Giants cleats. I was like, that's not good. I
Oh,
don't feel like
tell
teams
me
like the
more. Yeah.
Giants want to be shown up in that way. And that's
Okay.
how I saw it. And I was like, I don't know if that was wise, but at the same time, I thought he was so talented that people would sort of be chomping at the bit to get him, and I was like, what is going on? That's just Thursday night. My
Hmm.
reaction.
Yeah, I mean, watching the top 10, you're like, okay, the Giants, Abdul Carter, generational, maybe the next
Generation.
LT. Okay,
Right.
I get it. You're looking. I'm looking at the Browns. They basically pass on him twice because they trade down. They get Mason
Right.
Graham. Then I'm thinking about my Raiders at pick six. I'm like, oh, it'd be nice. People were asking me who would you like before the draft. I was like, give me Genty or Sanders,
Come on.
or Hunter in like a dream scenario.
Of
Uh,
course.
but I get it. I'm like, okay, they don't want they signed Geno. They gave him some good money. They don't want to draft a quarterback first
Yeah.
over, or in the first round. Okay, and then other teams kind of show up. They're like the Saints at 9. The Giants trade back in. The Steelers. I'm like, these are teams that need a quarterback, especially the Saints. Now we know Derek Carr retired. Uh,
Exactly.
you know, and I think they probably read that in the tea leaves, and they end up drafting a quarterback. We'll get to him.
Right.
But the first round, I was like, okay, a lot of great quarterbacks are not drafted in the first round. You know,
Truth.
we have Jalen Hurts, Super Bowl winner, Russell Wilson, Super Bowl winner.
Right.
Guys that maybe fit the Sanders mold of like they don't have the perfect physical prototype that
For
NFL
sure.
teams are looking for. And then, but he just keeps dropping. So once we got past, I don't know, second, third round, where did your mind go watching this guy drop even further?
It really started to feel. I mean, we toss the word conspiracy around too often, but you know, this happens with regular jobs, right? Like if you are in a particular industry, it's not unheard of for me to call the colleague across the way and be like, "Hey, I wouldn't pick this person if I were you. Just I've had some pretty bad experiences, and we're not supposed to talk poorly about people in our references, but sometimes that still happens where people just kind of say it without even saying it, and it really started to feel by this point that you're describing, it started to feel like, oh, this isn't just folks saying, oh, we don't need him. Because as you mentioned, teams that absolutely need a quarterback, like the Steelers had no quarterback at that point. And I was like, what are you doing? We saw the Saints eventually had the news of Derek Carr retiring, but it wasn't like Derek Carr was killing it for the Saints. I saw a lot of Saints fans rejoicing once
Yeah,
he announced his
absolutely.
retirement. So this is not someone who, oh, this is like the savior of our franchise either. Teams that really needed a quarterback, especially a quarterback of Shedeur's caliber, were just passing on him. And I said, wait, that doesn't make any sense. So this is what I started to think. I hate to use the word conspiracy because it's such a serious word that gets tossed around all the time now, but it just made you think what sort of conversation was happening to make everyone make the same decision in spite of their own interests.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, you talk about a quarterback of Shadur's caliber. So I think one thing to clear up is, a college resume, big numbers doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get drafted early, right?
Of course.
Even the Unitas Award, people were throwing that around. People were using Gardner Minshew as a parallel, like he had similar numbers. Guys like that. The other guy, the really cool quarterback from Hawaii, I'm blanking on his name, but there's a
Yes.
long list of quarterbacks that put up big numbers, win awards, and then don't get drafted or don't get drafted early. But I think the key difference is everyone was telling us that Shedeur was going to get drafted early. You know?
And I heard Bomani Jones talk about this and saying that just because the way he was positioning it was like, just because they were saying he was going to get drafted early didn't mean that those who've been paying attention to college football religiously believed he'd get drafted early. And that is an important distinction to make. But at the same time, I just it's really just feels like a setup then to have so much hype around it, and for those of us who've been following what Dion's done with Colorado and all the energy, and if you want to use the word hype, we can use the word hype around the program. It just didn't seem to go along with the narrative at that point. It just felt so jarring because after all, we did just see Travis get picked at a high point, so it couldn't have all just been just flash and no substance. So you're like, Travis gets picked at a high number. He's the Heisman winner. So But we've also seen Heisman winners not translate to NFL success. That's been a thing too. But at the same time, seeing Travis, you're like, oh, Travis and Shedeur are going to get picked in that first round. So not seeing that happen for Shedeur, and once again, just seeing him just drop and drop and drop. I remember being at like a baby shower on Saturday, and everyone was just watching it like, he still didn't get picked yet? Like, it's just really completely confusing.
I was kind of obsessing over it. I'll be honest. Like
No doubt.
those 2, 3 days, all right, Thursday, sure, first round, okay. Friday, second, third round, Dylan Gabriel gets picked, who by all accounts was, I'm not trying to claim like I'm some mock draft expert, but I did a
No
lot of mock
doubt.
drafts for Just Blog Baby, which is the Raiders site on Fansided.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was deep diving into all the mock drafts and the scouting reports and everything, and everyone was talking about Dylan Gabriel being too small for the position.
Right.
Like, okay, maybe he's Baker Mayfield, whatever it is, but from a like physical perspective, there was no reason for Shedeur to drop this far. I mean, he's
Yeah.
6'1", 6'2", which is about, it's not huge for a quarterback, but
No, but
about
it's
right.
good solid size.
Yeah, and he has all the physical tools, the arm, everything like that. So I'm with you where it started to feel like this is bigger than football, especially because of all the other guys that ended up getting drafted ahead of him.
Right.
We mentioned Gabriel, Tyler Shuck for the Saints, who they picked 40th overall. Jackson Dart, sure, okay, maybe he's an exciting prospect, but Tyler Shuck is a almost 26-year-old quarterback that,
Come on.
you know what I'm
Come
saying?
on.
So
It's a grown man.
exactly, right? He's a rookie, and he's, I think, the oldest quarterback in the room now that Derek Carr is retired. So
Gotta be.
I mean, how much credence do you give to people just saying, you know what, he didn't interview well, so that's why he dropped?
Well, I do think that's important, but something that I sort of, when I heard that, I tried to really, really interrogate that. And I wondered, right? This is all presumption. I will qualify it with that. But I do think, especially, I started to think about this even more intensely after Cam Ward was picked first. Because Cam's immediate reaction, the way he carries himself, is like immense gratitude. He's exuding humility. He's so appreciative for the opportunity to even play in the NFL. And I was saying to everyone who listened to me, I was like, it's going to be hard for Shedeur to feel that way when he grew up having, like, I don't know, Jerry Rice and Emmett Smith over his house having cookouts. You know what I mean? Like, this is not something new to him. And I say it in this way, as an educator, when I worked at a boarding school and my sons were super, super little, they would walk around the boarding school with me. And part of what would go through my mind was by the time they go to high school or college, they're not going to be intimidated by any of this. I work at a seminary now, graduate school, and the boys come here and they see the seminary president, they see professors, and they're just like, hi, and they play catch on the lawn of the seminary. So by the time, if any of them go to grad school, they're not going to be like, oh, I've never been in a place like this before. So I think that translates. How would Shedeur have the same sort of posture as Cam when that's not how he grew up? He grew up with economic privilege. He grew up with resources. His dad is one of the most famous athletes of my lifetime and was heavily involved in his life and took him with all these things. Why would he carry himself, to use the old phrase, with his hat in his hand and act as if he's just so appreciative of this? To the converse, I think he probably acted like, yeah, this is where I'm supposed to be. And so I can see how that sort of posture would not translate to interviewing well for people who are expecting him to have a much more humble approach.
Absolutely. The word that got thrown around a lot was entitled.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And there was one soundbite that kept making the rounds. It was Todd McShay, I think, on the Ryan Russillo podcast. I remember hearing it for the first time, where he said it was kind of like he was trying to dance around it being a criticism, but he said, it's not verbatim, but basically he got the sense, or teams got the sense, two teams that told him separately, that Shedeur didn't seem to care what they think of him.
Yeah.
And you can take that how you want it, right?
Right.
If you already have a negative opinion, just like anything else that he says comes out of his mouth, if you already have a negative opinion of him, you're going to say, You're going to go from he's confident to arrogant,
Yeah.
cocky, entitled, instead of, self assured, confident, not secure in who he is as a person, So it's all about the perception. And I think the interesting thing you brought up was the gratitude. And obviously he is grateful for a chance to play in the NFL. I think we've seen that from him,
Hmm.
post draft. But he's not going to be groveling for a spot in the NFL. And I think people that maybe some of the detractors will say, "Oh, he's not hungry enough," as
Yeah.
if having the privilege of being in an NFL locker room, and or maybe I don't know if he was old enough. I think his dad played till he was 37, so yeah, he was
Yeah,
probably
he,
around.
he he has memories of his dad in the league. Has to.
Yeah, I think on Washington and especially on the Ravens when he was in his late 30s, so I'm sure he was around
Yeah,
for that. And to me, I'm looking at that as a positive.
absolutely.
Recent examples. I mean, these guys are all-time greats, but Steph Curry, Klay Thompson grew up in NFL or NBA locker rooms. They know what it's like
Come
to be a
on.
pro athlete. The
Right.
direct quarterback parallel of Patrick Mahomes growing up in MLB locker rooms,
That's
knowing what
right.
it's like to carry himself as a pro athlete. So how did these things that I think objectively are positives, how did they get spun into negatives and attacks on this guy's character?
I think we can't help but understand the way all of these attributes, all of these characteristics have been racialized over time, right? So and it's not just racialized, but also just viewed through the lens of social location, right? So there are qualities you may have as a man that if a woman has them aren't received in the same way, right? We see this all the time with politicians, where it's just like, oh, I don't like how she was so loud, or she just came off as like too rude. Whereas a man would be lauded for his assertion, like he's strong, he's confident. These are not qualities that are generally appreciated when female leaders are demonstrating this. I think in the same way, there are ways that we have been socialized in the U.S. to really understand confidence in black men differently. Because I love that you brought up the examples of like Patrick Mahomes, Steph Curry, and Klay Thompson. All three of them, I would argue, are extremely confident people, but none
100%.
of them demonstrate that confidence the way Shedeur does, right? Like we're seeing, like Steph has moments where he's kind of like talking with the crowd, and like he's kind of like mischievous with everything. Clay is cool and collected. Patrick Mahomes is kind of like in his own world and comes out there and destroys the team. I see Shador having a lot of swagger, much like that brother behind your shoulder right there, right? Where he would tell you what round he's gonna knock you out in. And that's not the kind of confidence America has generally loved from brothers. They like the sort of confidence that's like, I'm just working really hard and I'm sort of quiet about it. I'm not worried, I'm not scared, but I'm definitely sure of myself. They don't like the sort of confidence that's going to tell you exactly how you're about to lose, and I think that's the kind of confidence Shedeur has. I think it's also, as I'm watching the NBA playoffs, I'm so fascinated by Anthony Edwards and how he carries himself
I was
because it's
swear
a
to God, I was just
very
thinking the
similar
same
style of
thing.
confidence. Very
Yeah,
similar.
yeah. I think in basketball, it's okay to be an individual, right?
Yes.
It's almost
Yes.
it's almost expected, right? Because when people are having arguments, it's about who the GOAT is. It's not, oh, the 96 Bulls against the 2019 or 2016 Cavs. It's LeBron
Right.
versus Jordan, right?
Yes.
Every basketball conversation is almost distilled to as if it's a one-on-one game at the park,
No
right?
question.
So, I mean, it even comes down to the uniform, right? Like basketball players basically playing in their underwear, you know?
Yeah.
So you can see
Right.
you see every tattoo on their body just about, you see every
Come
expression
on.
they make,
That's
the
right.
names printed on the back of the jersey. And then on the NFL side, there's players that have been in the league for, 5, 10 years, and I legitimately do not know what they look like.
No.
Yeah. I bring up
I,
this
I, had, the, I
example
had the
like,
same
yeah,
conversation earlier this week when we're talking about Jaden Daniels, a quarterback for the Commanders, and the sort of moment where he was sitting next to Juju Watkins during the March Madness tournament. His mom sat in between, and I was just saying I don't understand what her problem is because if Jaden was walking down the street, I probably wouldn't notice it was him. But if I saw Juju Watkins, I'm like, Juju! Like, it's a very different level of superstardom. And to your point, basketball players, it's much easier to cultivate a whole brand around them. Football, I think, Dion aside and other sort of personalities like that, Ocho Cinco, Shannon Sharp, people like that now, it's generally been sort of like cultivating around the myth and the mythology that the person has around them. Like none of us really know Tom Brady's personality until he started commentating on games. You kind of get a sense of, oh, this is who he actually is. He's actually a person. Before it was just kind of like, oh, this mythic figure who's just an amazing quarterback, but you never really got to know his personality. Whereas basketball, what you see is what you get.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that because I saw a clip of Jalen Warren, a running back from the Steelers, who apparently is Samoan. I had no idea.
No clue.
I mean, his name isn't, Jalen Polamalu or something. So I
That's
just,
right. That's right. That's right.
I assumed he just, he's another black man in the NFL. And then
Exactly. Exactly.
turns out he's 100% Samoan. So
That's
I just
awesome.
thought about that as a funny thing of like, there's just like kind of this anonymous quality that comes with a lot of NFL players. And
Totally.
you talked about Dion and some of these other guys that were able to show personality, Ocho Cinco, et cetera. And it's always these skill positions, these other
Yes.
skill positions, right? You can be a cornerback that's dancing, high stepping on the way to the end zone, or a
Hmm.
receiver. Like no one cares that Justin Jefferson wears diamond chains under his
No.
pads because he's a
Uh-uh.
receiver. It's
Right.
okay,
Right.
right? But when it's a
Sauce.
quarterback, yeah, Sauce Gardner, they have great nicknames, Pac-Man Jones, Sauce Gardner, all these guys. But this same like acceptance of eccentricity and diva qualities, if you want to call it that, just has
Right.
not made it to the quarterback position yet. Why
Not
is
yet.
that?
Because I think the quarterback position is still so tied to this mythology of rugged masculinity in the United States, right? So they're still very much kind of like the frontiersmen who's just, going to take their lunch pail to work and get it done. And I don't think we have the capacity as a consuming public to really stomach quarterbacks with a lot of personality. If we think even the long, arduous battle to have black quarterbacks. So now we're at the point where we have a ton of black quarterbacks in the league. You don't feel so attached to someone's success in a way you did, when it was like Donovan McNabb, you know what I mean? Or like even generations before, with like Warren Moon or Doug Williams. I think even the ones who have been tremendously successful, like Jalen Hurts, is a very charismatic person, but he's not just like super extroverted and filling the room. He's sort of drawing the attention to the room with his coolness. But it's so I would say that the quarterback still has almost like, translating it to baseball, a Derek Jeter style of cool, far more than any sort of bombastic personality. We don't really have the space for it yet because we're still so attached to the mythology of sort of like cool, calm, and collected quarterback.
Yeah, they still want, even though this is an era where a 5'10" quarterback is fine. Jalen Hurts is listed as 6'1", 6'2". He's probably not.
Right.
The era of the athletic quarterback is here. But I
Mm-hmm.
think in a lot of the minds of these GMs or owners, especially the owners that are ultimately
Especially.
making these decisions, especially a quarterback this high in the draft, they still want Johnny Unitas.
No
Strong
doubt.
jawline, line, buzz cut, military cut, whatever you want to call it,
That's
stoic
it.
leadership. And what came to mind as you were talking is that, that whole thing about, being black or being a minority in America is you have to work twice as hard for half the recognition or
That's
whatever the
real.
phrase might be. And I think about guys like Mahomes who are very demonstrative, right? He is cocky. He's
Mm-hmm.
trucking a defender at the 1 yard line and he's flexing over him. He has,
Truth.
the mohawk haircut. He's doing commercials and that's all okay because he's won 3 Super Bowls.
Yeah.
But then I think about him compared to Cam Newton, who didn't quite get there, or Colin Kaepernick, who had his signature flex where he's kissing
Right.
his bicep, or Cam
That's
Newton,
right.
where it's like these guys are all pro, MVP, Pro Bowl level quarterbacks, but they're not allowed to express themselves in the same way as Mahomes because they're not winning 3 Super Bowls or in the GOAT conversation. I mean,
Right.
what do you think of that theory or that idea when it comes, especially to Shedeur, who had great individual success at Colorado, but his win-loss record is always brought up as a
Right,
negative.
right, right. Well, I think well, a couple of things. Like one, I was of the stance that whatever Shedeur, Travis, and Coach Dion were able to accomplish at Colorado was absolutely playing with house money because the program had been so awful before. If they had 3 win seasons, it would have been an accomplishment. So we need to disqualify everything from that juncture. But I think also winning does cure a lot of things. I think people are far more accepting of personalities if you're winning. I think the personality that's loud but you're losing is annoying, right? I think that's just
Yeah,
universally true.
100%.
But I also think just with the examples that you brought up of Mahomes, Kaepernick, and Cam Newton, Cam Newton is not Eurocentric. Like he is just eccentric in general and just very, very, the way he like writes captions on Instagram, the way he dresses, like the whole way he carries and stuff, it is very different for just anybody, right? And then Kaepernick, of course, with all of the work that he was doing in activism, and we've seen how he was effectively like blackballed out of the NFL. I think Mahomes, even with the bravado, and I know he recently cut off the mohawk, and I'll tie that back in to my statement. I think Mahomes moves from a very Eurocentric way of viewing himself culturally. I don't think that he moves with a sense of like my culture is grounded in an African American experience. I know that's often a sticky road for biracial people, but I think that in his uh, how he's expressed himself, the way he talks about things from what I've heard, it's not someone who's like grounded in an African American experience whatsoever. I think it's someone who's very much comfortable with being in a white sort of mainstream middle America experience. And I used the example of him cutting his hair. I saw him do a presser with presumably Kansas City reporters, and he talked about cutting off his nappy hair and just being like, I don't know why you all let me have this hair for so long. And I was just there like kind of appalled because as you can see, I have my hair out, not intentionally for this part, but just out today. Patrick Mahomes' hair texture isn't much different than mine. And I think that, if you were grounded in African American cultural experience, you'd understand that the word nappy is a very loaded word, especially if you're using it outside of, in a room that is not majority black. You know what I mean? So for him to say that to a room of reporters, regardless of what their racial makeup, presumably not mostly black in that space, it
Yeah.
just was
I mean,
like,
it's
man,
not
like
like an insult in itself, but it's often used as an insult.
it's often used as an insult, but it's also very much, if you're not using it as an inside word, it's very much an insult. You know what I mean? So I think it was just very, at best, peculiar word choice. And how I received it was like troubling, like, man, like, why do you think that's okay right now? You know what I mean? So that just to me gave great insight into my general point of I don't think Mahomes' bravado is grounded in a sort of like African American expression or sort of like understood ways of expressing yourself in the black experience that I think if they were would not be as accepted even with all the winning he's doing.
It's one of those things where it's kind of hard to describe, but you know it when you see it.
1,000%.
And I totally see your point about the kind of where he's moving from, right? He's appearing at a Morgan Wallen concert, who has
Right.
his own complicated history with
No doubt.
slurs and other stuff that
No
he's been caught
doubt.
on camera saying. And he's not at a, I don't know, he's a little Uzi Vert or whatever, some other
Right.
hip hop artist
He's not
concert.
gonna be at the
So
Kendrick concerts this summer. I can guarantee it, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly. Which is where Shador was probably going to be. I think people made a big deal out of the draft party that Shador
Right.
had at his house, and then the after party that he had after he got drafted. And these things are all, used as negatives, even though it's like this. He grew up rich. He's a rich
Yeah.
kid that's got a lot of money, whether he plays it down in the NFL or not,
Right.
because of his dad and NIL and all that stuff. So it's become a fascinating conversation about the NFL kind of parading as a meritocracy. And to me, what comes to mind, the image that comes to mind, it's almost like a graph of there's a line, the y-axis or x-axis is talent, y-axis is distraction, whatever you
Right.
want to call it. And it's like there has to be a point where those two lines meet, where it's acceptable, and anything beyond that on the distraction side, quote unquote, becomes unacceptable in the realm of the NFL.
But what's
And
so funny about that though is that we're talking about, let's say all the rumors are true that Shedeur in these interviews was completely obnoxious. We're talking like Carlton Banks from Fresh Prince levels of obnoxious,
like all
right?
the memes of him, insulting them, walking in with, 100 pounds of chains on and all
Yes,
that stuff. Yeah.
let's assume all of that is true. How is any of that more offensive than, let's say, the teams that have, gentlemen who've been accused of like domestic violence? How is any of that more offensive than gentlemen who've been accused of sexual assault or like, racism and homophobia and all these things? How is this kid just being like a Richie Rich kind of kid more offensive than any of those things that are like, some of which are like actual crimes? This is the problem that I have with sort of like the moral inconsistency that the NFL often demonstrates. We're like, oh, he doesn't fit. He's not a part of the culture. It's like, how is it okay for this person who's like, driven drunk or whatever the case may be? Like, they're good for the team. Like, make it make sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it doesn't. It doesn't hold up to any level of scrutiny. I think that logic, at least. I mean, if you're just talking football and the culture of football, the almost, militaristic culture of
Right.
everyone needs to fall in line and we can accept your, you know, I don't know what you want to call them, off-field indiscretions,
Yeah.
which is, I think, maybe that's a bigger conversation about being a man and masculinity in America and what's
Totally.
acceptable among men and what's not. But that's a whole other podcast. I think that's probably
Absolutely.
far beyond our scope. That's definitely like an academic level conversation, I think.
Oh,
But
for sure.
I mean, ultimately, what do you think convinced the Browns to draft him? 144th overall. I guess they were finally able to overlook the bad interviews because we got to a certain point in the draft and they already have four quarterbacks on their roster. Like
Right.
it was all so strange that, especially the fact that he ends up in Cleveland, who already drafted a
Yes.
quarterback. Like, why Cleveland?
I mean, I've heard reports that, like, what ultimately convinced him was the owner's insistence, right? So that always helps. But you know the audacity of having reservations about him while you're still employing Deshaun Watson. You know what I mean? Like, just like, hello, read
Yeah,
the room, my friends.
there you go.
So that's that part. But I can't imagine Shador not being able to compete for that starting job, especially with Deshaun still being out. I really just don't imagine a universe, barring injury or any sort of catastrophe, where he's not at least in the conversation, where he's not coming out of training camp as at worst second string. And it just would astound me beyond belief. I really do think that, and this is not me saying I think he's going to be a Hall of Famer, but I do think he's going to have a productive NFL career if given the shot. If the NFL is the meritocracy that it often pretends to be, I think he will have a sustainable NFL pro career. But I do think that ultimately what was able to convince them was the owner's insistence and just the absurdity of it all. Like, you all, even with the three quarterbacks you have, still very much need Shador. Like, I don't see a reality where that's not true for the Browns. Like, let's be honest and be realistic. Like, we're still the Cleveland Browns. I don't know what sort of high aspirations you have, like, but you should actually just be real about yourself in this case.
Yeah, Cleveland is the quarterback graveyard. It's one of those franchises. The Jets. We were talking about the Jets before the hit record.
Yes, we were.
The Bears. I don't know. There's a list of NFL franchises where quarterback careers go to die, and that was my worry when he got drafted by the Browns. Was, oh
Of
man,
course.
Cleveland. Like that's not
Wasn't
the best
exciting.
situation. Exactly. But the silver lining, I think, is he's one of four quarterbacks. They have Kenny Pickett, who is a journeyman at this point. Joe
Yeah.
Flacco, who's I think at 40 at this point, so he's not he's not anyone's long term solution.
No.
But it was just curious that they spent two picks on quarterbacks, and he's going to be competing with Dylan Gabriel, I think, essentially for that starting spot, unless of course they go veteran first and all that. But that's the silver lining, is that there is not an established starter that he's going to have to overcome. It's not like he got drafted to Kansas City or Philadelphia or some of these other teams that took quarterbacks late, as this is clearly our backup. this is the guy that we're going to develop for the next couple of years as a cheap backup. So that's the only silver lining. And I think his preseason games are probably going to be some of the most anticipated.
No question.
Even more so than Cam Ward. I mean, no offense to Cam Ward, but you're the number one overall pick. Everyone is expecting you to succeed.
Right.
Right. And it's almost going to be kind of that Jake Paul phenomenon or the Floyd Mayweather phenomenon where people are going to be tuning in because they want to see you fail.
Yeah,
And
that's real.
so,
That's real.
I mean, I'm not one of those people, but just from the social media reactions I've seen of, me posting clips of
Totally.
Shedeur, it's rage bait for no
Yes, it
reason.
is.
It's an
It is.
innocuous clip of him throwing a touchdown to Travis Hunter, and it becomes this huge argument about him and his dad and all that stuff. So, I mean, so you said you think you can see him winning that job. What's the best case scenario for his rookie season?
I think the best case scenario is number one, to stay injury free. I don't have. I mean, that AFC North is like a terror dome, man. Like this, like every team just like fighting to the death. So I don't have high aspirations for the Browns in that division this year. But I do think he can have a productive season. I don't know if I'm thinking about like an actual number. I think he can throw. I'll give him like 12 touchdowns. You know what I mean? I don't imagine him just like being lights out. But I do think he can have like a decent year where he just stays injury free and just learns. I hope that's really my main hope for him, is that he takes this year and just like drinks it in as a learning year and just is really willing to learn. It's amazing that he has like Tom Brady on tech, so that's always going to help, but I think even more so just being able to say, what can I learn from this? Because you're not going to win anything, so you might as well learn something in the process.
It's funny you mentioned Tom Brady. That was one of the reasons I almost assumed that he was going to be a Raider at some point. They passed him
That
up.
was
I don't
what my
know.
hope was. I was
Yeah.
wanting. I've said to you off air, I don't have an NFL team anymore. I grew up a Cowboys fan, but I allowed myself to divorce the Cowboys, and I feel free, and I just play fantasy football with my frat brothers and my friends. But had he gone to the Raiders, because I had a Raiders jersey in high school, I would have been a fan
Was it
of the
Charles
Silver.
Woodson? Tim
I think
Brown?
it was, yeah, it probably was Charles Woodson. Yeah,
Okay.
it was about that time. It was either him or Tim Brown. I can't remember, but it's like one of them. But like, I definitely was obsessed with the Raiders. At that time, so I would have definitely been a full-fledged fan of them. But it just that really did shock me that he didn't get picked, and it added to the sort of like, what's going on? Like at the very least, the person who like knows me for real should have said something. But who knows?
Yeah, and they end up drafting two quarterbacks. I think one is transitioning to wide receiver, but they do
Right.
draft a quarterback late. But it just seemed like a perfect football scenario. You have Geno Smith, who's 34. He's going to be there for a few years. You have Shedeur waiting in the wings.
Right.
Maybe the downside is if Geno has a 2-3 interception game, maybe the media starts asking, hey, is this kid going to get a shot?
Yeah.
That dies down. People will forget.
Absolutely.
I mean, he's the backup quarterback. There's going to be some shots of him, holding the clipboard on the sideline, and anytime the starter struggles, but I don't think to the point where it could destabilize the locker room. So it didn't make sense to me that the Raiders would pass him up, or the Steelers, or any number of teams that ended up drafting a quarterback either before him or shortly after him and later in the draft. So it's just, there's a point where, like we've talked about, it goes from being, this is maybe because he interviewed poorly, or maybe his arm isn't what people think, or whatever, all these lists of excuses, becomes a point where it's like, there's been much worse quarterbacks who have been drafted way earlier, and they've either panned out or not. And it's like any pick in the draft is a gamble, and it just seemed like there was a collusion element of, maybe we need to knock this kid down a peg or two, or him and his dad,
Right.
because they were talking a little crazy about, there's certain teams my son's not going to play for. It's like, okay, sure.
But how was it crazier than the Manning family? The Manning family is allowed to do this. What's
Absolutely.
the difference? Like, Eli did not want to go play for the Chargers. I mean, what's wrong with San Diego? It's beautiful. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
John Elway did the same thing. I mean, it was a long time ago, but it was
That's
the same
right.
idea of I'm going to go play baseball.
That's right.
So, and the thing is, many times we've talked about guys who have slipped in the draft a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Lamar Jackson, Aaron
Sure.
Rodgers, whatever, Will Levis a couple years back, just as a recent example. Some people said, oh, he's a first round pick, but then he ends up going in the third round, which is
That's
like,
right.
okay, Shedeur, maybe you are a third rounder. That's okay. You can still be a productive NFL quarterback. You still have a 10, 15-year career. You can still possibly win a Super Bowl like
No
Russell Wilson
doubt.
we mentioned at the top.
Right.
Just I think we're on the same page here as far as hoping for success, but maybe concerned because he is in quarterback hell in Cleveland in the AFC
Yes.
North. But it will of course be watching very closely, like I think a lot of football fans and maybe
No
not some
doubt.
football fans that just want to see him fail.
Some people just want to see
Um,
him fail. Right.
yeah, how weird was it that Donald Trump decided to speak out? I want to hear your thoughts on that of him adding some spice to the discourse.
Well, that was, he is one of the most unpredictable people in my lifetime, and to see him, be so effusive in his praise for Shador was very confusing. it was like, I was like, wow, this is. I didn't expect to agree with you about anything. Here we are. Just it really was a moment that I'm just curious, and it makes me wonder. Like a lot of times we get these sort of like biopics and giant like movies or books about presidents and other world figures. And I just really need to know like what was happening in that moment because I know President Trump watches a lot of television, and I just really wanted to know like what talking head was he parroting in that moment to be like, this is wrong. Like, why has Shadeur not gotten picked? Because I didn't expect the people who were saying this is a miscarriage of justice, tantamount to how Colin Kaepernick was treated, to be on the same perspective as President Trump. Like, it's just not what I would have ever expected or could have called ever in my life. It just was a very bizarre moment that just adds to the absurdity of this age. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And I think it was confusing for us, but I'm sure it was confusing for a lot of MAGA folks that probably, had a lot of reservations about
That's right.
Shador and his character and oh, he's cocky and look at the chains and all that. And then
Yeah,
their dear leader comes out and says this kid needs to
that's my
get
guy.
drafted. Yeah, exactly. So I'm sure they're even more confused than we were.
No
And
question.
I think they just maybe just rich guys used to hang out. So back in the day, him and
That's
Dion probably used to party together.
I,
And
I can't help but think Dion's been very good to him at Atlantic City at some point. You know what I mean? Like that's the only thing I could think of. Is like Dion was just like hanging out with Trump back in the '90s, and he's like, nice kid. I like his son. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
when Trump was trying to get into the NFL as an owner and and
Right,
then the USFL and all that, maybe they crossed paths.
right.
I'm sure they did at some point.
Had to,
So.
had to.
And speaking of Dion, before we wrap up here, have you been following Colorado and how things are going in prep for the new season without the Heisman winner and Shador?
Well, yeah, I think what's so fascinating about him is that he has changed the way recruiting will be done forever. Like he's for some notoriously not doing the traditional like trips that a lot of coaches have to make, and I think he just has the advantage of yes being able to FaceTime a kid, and he's such an inspirational person. Like when you're just watching the clips of him online or watching any of the shows that he's been a part of, I can imagine that that's just infuriating for other coaches who have to work so much harder to attract talent. I think that he'll be able to use a lot of NIL to his benefit. I think he'll be able to use a lot of his charisma to his benefit. And just what I've paid most attention to, Khaled, was the way he's been hiring these NFL Pro Hall of Famers as coaches and stuff like that. So to be able to say, oh, I'm going to learn from Warren Sapp and like Marshall Falk and, oh, Michael Irvin's coming by later. I just think that's going to be really hard to compete with. It doesn't give me any delusions of grandeur in terms of saying, oh, they're going to be like dominant. But once again, it's kind of like when you're a mid-major program, which would be like very kind to what Colorado has been in football historically.
Sure. Yeah.
I think you just got to be excited about whatever this result is because it's never been this good before. Period. And I think that if he's given that space of latitude to continue to build and continue to get the trust that he frankly has earned at this point to continue to build things his way, I think they'll eventually be able to make some noise, but it takes time to take a program that had done, once again, nothing into something that's actually like competing for like significant bowl games and maybe even being in a title conversation. I think all of that is a while away, and it takes time to really create a sustainable program, especially a program that at this point is largely built around the person's personality.
Yeah, I mean, they were, I think, until the last week or two of the season in the Big 12 title conversation.
Right.
If they won that, they would have gotten into the CFP. So I think it's what I'm most curious about is how much success they can have without Travis Hunter, who obviously is a
Yeah,
generational type talent, and Shedeur, who, like it or not, was a great college quarterback at the very
absolutely.
least. So I'll be watching, of course, that, as someone who's adopted Colorado as my college football team.
For
I didn't
sure.
have one before, so I'm like, all right, this
Might as
this
well
works
come
out
on
well.
in now. The gear's cool.
Yeah, black and gold. I got my Shador, jersey from DH Gate hanging in my closet, so
Oh,
I'm
for
I'm
sure.
ready to go.
Let's
Um,
go.
well, I appreciate you, brother. Where can folks hear more from you and see more from you? I know you're doing a lot of things on social media and in the podcasting world. So, where can folks hear from you?
I appreciate you, man. So, at Baddest Chaplain on all platforms and baddestchaplain.com if you want to see all the podcasts I'm doing, all the writing I'm doing, just, trying to keep it going, man. Trying to be positive out in this world.
That's all we can do, man. Just keep the positivity going and just try to fight this tsunami of negativity
My goodness.
that's coming our way all the time.
That's
I
right.
appreciate you, brother. Thank you for your time.
I appreciate you.